For over 70 years, one family has ruled North Korea with absolute authority, maintaining a grip on power so complete that citizens must bow to portraits, collect human waste as tribute, and face execution for the smallest infractions. This obsession with control didn't appear out of nowhere, but was forged through centuries of invasion, isolation, and strategic adaptation to survive in one of the world's most volatile regions. To understand how North Korea became the world's most extreme dictatorship, we must journey back through more than 2,000 years of Korean history, examining how ancient kingdoms, foreign occupations, and Cold War politics created the perfect conditions for totalitarian rule. The story begins in 57 BC, when the Korean peninsula wasn't one unified nation but three separate kingdoms locked in perpetual warfare. Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Silla in the southeast. These kingdoms fought each other relentlessly for over 700 years, with rulers demanding absolute loyalty from their subjects under threat of death. The constant warfare created a culture where obedience to authority wasn't just encouraged but required for survival, and questioning leadership could mean immediate execution. This brutal competition for dominance established patterns of authoritarian control that would echo through Korean history for millennia. Eventually, in 668 AD, the kingdom of Silla emerged victorious and unified the Korean peninsula, but this achievement brought little peace. Korea immediately learned a harsh geopolitical lesson that would shape its national character. Survival meant accommodating more powerful neighbors. China, massive and militarily superior, loomed over Korea's northern border, and Korean kings quickly realized that maintaining independence required a delicate balancing act of paying tribute to Chinese emperors while preserving internal autonomy. This strategy of external submission, coupled with internal sovereignty, became deeply ingrained in Korean political culture, teaching leaders that appearing weak while maintaining hidden strength could ensure survival. The pattern continued through the centuries, and in 1392, a new dynasty called Joseon took power, ruling Korea for over 500 years. By 1882, Korea had become known as the Hermit Kingdom because it deliberately isolated itself from the outside world, believing that minimal foreign contact would prevent the kind of interference that threatened Korean independence. The strategy was simple: stay quiet, bow to China, pay tribute, and hope that the great powers would leave Korea alone. For several centuries, this approach worked remarkably well, allowing Korea to maintain its distinct culture and political system despite being surrounded by larger, more aggressive nations. However, Korea's geographic position between China, Japan, and Russia made complete isolation impossible, and the nation's neighbors increasingly sought to expand their influence over the peninsula. Japan invaded Korea in the 1590s, devastating the country and demonstrating Korea's vulnerability to foreign aggression. Over the following centuries, China, Japan, and Russia all competed for influence over Korea, forcing Korean leaders to play these powers against each other, bowing to whoever seemed strongest at any given moment, and doing whatever it took to survive as an independent entity. By 1910, Korea had spent more than 2,000 years learning brutal but effective lessons about power and survival. Absolute loyalty to the leader equals survival. Strict hierarchy maintains social order. Isolation protects from dangerous outside ideas. And most importantly, you must control your people completely or someone else will control them for you. These lessons, absorbed over millennia of warfare and foreign pressure, created a political culture that valued centralized authority, demanded unquestioning obedience, and viewed external influences with deep suspicion. This historical foundation would prove critical to understanding how Kim Il-sung could later transform North Korea into a totalitarian state unlike anything the world had seen before. In 1910, Korea disappeared from the map entirely when Japan formally annexed the peninsula, beginning 35 years of brutal colonial occupation that would traumatize the Korean people and inadvertently provide Kim Il-sung with a blueprint for totalitarian control. The Japanese occupation was exceptionally cruel, featuring forced labor that worked Koreans to death in mines and factories, the systematic use of Korean women as sex slaves, euphemistically called comfort women, and a comprehensive attempt to erase Korean culture and identity completely. Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names, speak only Japanese in public, worship at Shinto shrines, and even venerate the Japanese emperor as a divine being. Speaking Korean in public could result in arrest, beating, or worse, as Japan literally tried to make people forget they were Korean and transform them into loyal Japanese subjects. A young boy named Kim Il-sung, born Kim Sung-gru in 1912, grew up during this occupation and joined the anti-Japanese resistance as a teenager, fighting as a guerrilla in Manchuria alongside Chinese communist forces. While fighting the Japanese, Kim was learning something that would prove far more valuable than military tactics. He was studying exactly how Japan controlled millions of people through sophisticated propaganda and psychological manipulation. He observed how Japan built a personality cult around the emperor, portraying him as a living god, and how this religious veneration made questioning the emperor's authority literally unthinkable for most Japanese citizens. He saw how Japan rewrote history to glorify its own achievements while erasing events that didn't fit the official narrative, and how eliminating anyone who disagreed with the regime through imprisonment or execution prevented the emergence of organized opposition. Most importantly, Kim watched as Japan systematically destroyed Korean identity, making people forget who they were and replacing their cultural memory with Japanese propaganda. Kim studied this blueprint for totalitarian control very carefully, understanding that whoever controlled the narrative and the means of coercion could control an entire population indefinitely. The opportunity to implement these techniques arrived unexpectedly in August 1945, when World War II ended and Japan surrendered to Allied forces. Korea was finally free from colonial rule after 35 years of occupation, and Koreans celebrated in the streets, believing they would finally regain independence and self. However, Japan's surrender created a power vacuum that the Allied powers needed to fill, and the Americans and Soviets, already beginning their Cold War rivalry, accepted Japan's surrender on the Korean peninsula and made a fateful decision that would shape Korean history for generations. They drew a line across Korea at the 38th parallel of latitude, with the agreement that Soviet forces would accept Japanese surrender north of the line and American forces would handle the south. The division was supposed to be purely temporary, lasting perhaps a few months until free elections could be held to establish a unified Korean government. However, both superpowers had different ideas about Korea's future, with the Soviets wanting a communist state and the Americans preferring a capitalist democracy. And this fundamental disagreement would make reunification impossible. The Soviets installed Kim Il-sung as their chosen leader in the north, while the Americans backed Syngman Rhee to lead the south. Both men were authoritarian by temperament and recognized that free elections might result in their losing power to rivals. So they worked to consolidate their positions and make the temporary division permanent. The temporary line stayed for 1 year, then 2 years, then 5 years, and by 1950, there weren't just 2 occupation zones anymore, but 2 separate countries with completely different political systems, separate armies, and populations that increasingly viewed each other as enemies rather than fellow Koreans. Kim Il-sung had his territory in the north, Soviet backing that provided weapons and advisors, and the blueprint for total control he had learned from observing Japanese colonial techniques. But he wanted more. He wanted to conquer the south and rule all of Korea under his communist system. In early 1950, Kim traveled to Moscow to meet with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and proposed a bold plan to invade South Korea, claiming he could win the entire war in just 3 weeks before the Americans could effectively respond. Stalin eventually gave his conditional approval, and Kim also traveled to Beijing to secure support from Mao Zedong's newly established People's Republic of China. With backing from both communist powers, Kim began planning his invasion, confident that his superior numbers in Soviet tanks would crush South Korean forces before anyone could stop him. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a massive surprise attack that initially appeared to validate Kim's predictions. North Korean troops, equipped with Soviet tanks, rolled south rapidly, overwhelming South Korean defenders. Seoul fell in just 3 days, and by August 1950, UN and South Korean forces, which now included American ground troops, were squeezed into a tiny defensive perimeter around the southern port city of Busan. Then the situation changed dramatically on September 15, 1950, when American General Douglas MacArthur executed an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city near Seoul far behind North Korean lines. The landing worked brilliantly, catching North Korean forces completely by surprise and cutting their supply lines. Within 2 weeks, Seoul was retaken, and North Korean forces were in full retreat. By October, UN forces were deep inside North Korea, advancing toward the Chinese border, and Kim's easy 3-week war had become a complete disaster with North Korea hours from total defeat. Then China intervened massively. In late October 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, officially called volunteers, poured across the border into North Korea. The Chinese intervention pushed UN forces back through sheer numerical superiority, and the war ground into a brutal stalemate along a line very close to the original 38th parallel. Finally, on July 27, 1953, the warring parties signed an armistice agreement that stopped the fighting but didn't technically end the war. The final toll was staggering. Over 3 million people died, entire cities had been flattened, and after all that blood and suffering, the border ended up almost exactly where it had started in 1945. Despite having started a war that killed millions of his own people and nearly resulted in North Korea's total destruction, Kim Il-sung didn't face any consequences. Instead, he did something unprecedented in communist history. He systematically eliminated all rivals, and transformed himself from a political leader into a living god, worshipped by an entire population. After the war ended, people who questioned Kim's leadership started disappearing, arrested by the security services, and either executed or sent to labor camps. Pro-Soviet politicians were purged by 1956, and pro-China politicians met the same fate by 1958. By 1960, Kim Il-sung stood alone at the apex of North Korean power with no rivals left. However, Kim didn't just want political power, he wanted religious devotion. So in the 1960s he put his son Kim Jong-il in charge of propaganda, and together they embarked on creating the most comprehensive personality cult the world had ever seen. They rewrote North Korean history completely, claiming that Kim Il-sung was born on Korea's sacred Mount Paektu with miraculous signs including a double rainbow and singing swallows, claims that were total fabrications. They reset the entire North Korean calendar, making the year of Kim Il-sung's birth into year 1 of the Jukki calendar. Giant bronze statues of Kim Il-sung appeared in every city and town, and citizens were required to bow before them and keep them meticulously clean, with any disrespect punishable by imprisonment. Every North Korean home was required to display portraits of Kim Il-sung in the most prominent location, and people had to bow to these portraits every morning and keep them spotless. The regime told people that if their house caught fire, they had to save Kim's portrait first, even before saving their own children. And there were documented cases of people dying in fires because they went back to rescue the portrait instead of escaping. The regime then did something truly unprecedented by systematically erasing parts of the Korean language. The word for individual identity was removed from acceptable usage because individualism contradicted the collective spirit, which meant North Koreans couldn't express personal preferences individually. People were taught they belonged to a completely invented ethnic category designed to separate North Koreans psychologically from all other peoples. The North Korean language systematically eliminated words for concepts the regime wanted to erase. There were no words for romantic love between individuals, for freedom in the Western sense, for human rights, or even for psychological stress, because in the workers' paradise there was supposedly nothing to be stressed about. Every North Korean home received a radio that was hardwired to the propaganda station and couldn't be turned off, meaning citizens were subjected to regime propaganda constantly. Children were taught that birds and mice could hear and understand human speech and would report anti-regime comments to the authorities, creating a paranoid atmosphere. The regime implemented a system of collective punishment unprecedented in its cruelty. If one person committed a political crime, their parents, children, and grandchildren would all be sent to prison camps for life, with 3 generations punished for one person's mistake. In 1974, Kim Il-sung officially named his son, Kim Jong-il, as his successor, which shocked communist leaders worldwide because hereditary succession was completely contrary to communist principles. But by this point, North Korea had developed enough independence that objections didn't matter. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and all Soviet aid to North Korea stopped immediately, which was catastrophic for the North Korean economy. Kim Il-sung died in 1994 after 46 years in absolute power, and his son Kim Jong-il took over, inheriting his father's perfect system of totalitarian control, but facing economic collapse. When Soviet aid ended, the North Korean economy fell apart, with factories shutting down and no power for fertilizer production, causing agricultural yields to drop catastrophically. Massive floods in 1995 and 1996 destroyed huge amounts of farmland, and the government stayed silent while people starved. The survival stories from this period are horrific. People ate grasshoppers, tree bark, rats, and scavenged for anything remotely edible. Dead bodies appeared on streets daily, and some people, driven mad by hunger, resorted to cannibalism. Estimates suggest between 2 million and 3.5 million North Koreans died during the famine, roughly 10 to 15% of the entire population. The long-term effects are still visible. The average North Korean is now 3 to 4 inches shorter than the average South Korean, because of years of malnutrition during childhood. Kim Jong-il's response was to make the world too scared to invade. So in 2006, North Korea tested its first nuclear bomb, creating the regime's ultimate insurance policy against foreign intervention. In 2011, Kim Jong-il died, and his youngest son Kim Jong-un took over at just 27 years old. Many Western experts predicted he would fail, but they were completely wrong. Kim Jong Un proved even more ruthless than his father, immediately consolidating power through brutal protection. He executed his own uncle Jeong Song-thaek, reportedly by anti-aircraft gun, and apparently ordered the assassination of his half-brother Kim Jong-nam, who was killed in Malaysia's airport when 2 women smeared VX nerve agent on his face. Kim Jong Un accelerated the nuclear weapons program dramatically, conducting multiple nuclear tests and developing intercontinental ballistic missiles. And in 2017, the world genuinely worried about nuclear war. Life in North Korea today remains surreal and horrifying. Every family must collect 1 ton of human feces yearly to be used as fertilizer, and people lock their outhouses so neighbors don't steal their There are no public trash cans because nothing ever gets thrown away. The average wage is approximately $2 per month, and sometimes passenger trains run out of electricity and passengers have to get out and push. The regime operates vast political prison camps where people work in terrible conditions, often dying from malnutrition, disease, or beatings. Women who escape to China often get trapped and cannot return home, with hundreds of thousands stuck there now. People can be executed for letting dust accumulate on portraits, not crying enthusiastically enough during official mourning, or watching foreign movies. In 2014, the United Nations concluded that the human rights abuses in North Korea were worse than almost anything documented since World War II. Today, 26 million people live under this system, trapped in what is effectively the world's largest prison, unable to leave, access uncensored information, or criticize their leaders, creating a country that was never supposed to exist but has endured for 3/4 of a century and shows no signs of ending.